Maastricht, the name means crossing the River Maas, and this Dutch city bridges languages, currencies, and cultures. It is an international city with all the unique charm of the Netherlands. And today, on VE Day, it is a city that remembers the triumph and the tragedy of World War II. This is week 2 of Good Morning America's Passport to Europe.
And good morning, everyone. Good to have you with us. I'm Charles Gibson.
And I'm Joan London. It is Monday, May 8th, and it is VE Day. It is the 50th anniversary of the Allied victory in Europe, and we are in downtown Maastricht in Our Lady Square.
But this is a favorite town of ours.
It's a beautiful little town.
We broadcast once before from here back in 1989, and everybody on the staff loved this city. We wanted to come back here. It is nestled down in the southeast corner of the Netherlands, right in the confluence of Belgium, Germany, France, Luxembourg, all nations very much involved in World War II. This is a city with a lot of history, but it is also a city that looks forward, because here really was drawn the roadmap of the new Europe. You may have heard of the Treaty of Maastricht that was signed in 1991. That set out the prospects for a European Union, and as that comes to pass, it will mean that there are fewer border restrictions in Europe, also fewer trade barriers, and also possibly in time, a single European currency, although that last goal may be very hard to reach, as you will hear in a few moments from our money editor, Tyler Matheson.
And you know, we come here and we hear so much about the history, but our geography editor, Harm de Blay, really was living here at the time as a young boy. He hid from the Nazis. He actually was in a town right near Rotterdam, and that's where Spencer Christian is this morning. Spencer, good morning.
Good morning, Joan. Yes, I'm in the city of Rotterdam in the old port district of Delfshaven, and this is life on the water. This is a country of over 2,200 miles of waterways and canals, and it's not uncommon to find people living in vessels like this, these historic cargo vessels. We're going to be showing you a lot more of Rotterdam and talking about the history of this port of Delfshaven in this coming half hour. Charlie?
All right, thanks very much, Spencer. The news of this morning comes both from the United States and Europe. We will go to the United States in a few moments, where Morton Dean is standing by at Arlington National Cemetery, or right outside the cemetery. But in London this morning, with the news of the way Europe is observing VE Day, is Peter Jennings. Peter?
Good morning, Charlie, and good morning, Joan. It's interesting seeing you there in Holland. We've so many people here from so many parts of the world. You've got Americans and Canadians there who helped to liberate that country as well. Here we've had representatives from more than 50 countries who've been participating in this quite astonishing British celebration of the last couple of days. Today it is Family Day here in Hyde Park, which has been the center place, at least, for people to remember what they had struggled for through all the long years of the war, and how much they were celebrating today, even though these were very hard times. And if you take another look, that's outside Buckingham Palace, very much the center point again this morning, as it was 50 years ago. The Queen Mother, who was the wife of King George VI 50 years ago, came out with the Queen and the Queen's sister, Princess Margaret, to an enormous crowd here. Again, as I said, reminding people of what it was like. That's Princess Margaret on the right, the Queen Mother, 95 years old this year.
All weekend, this great park has been filled to overflowing with those who fought in World War II and those too young to comprehend yet what their grandparents sacrificed.
Oh, we lost you.
It is both celebration and commemoration. They have come from more than 50 countries, all of which participated in the Allied campaign against Germany. The political leaders of those nations, many of whom are in Paris today, gathered in London's majestic St. Paul's Cathedral to give thanks for the victory of good over evil, and with the German Chancellor Kohl in attendance to emphasize reconciliation. During the bombing of London, this cathedral came to symbolize British resistance. The Germans hid it, but could never destroy it. The British royal family has been at the center of every celebration here. Prince Charles and Diana were there together with their 2 sons. The current Queen Elizabeth was a young army volunteer during the war. The star this weekend has been the Queen Mother. She is 95 years old and has been at every event.
This day will bring back many memories to many people.
During the war, the Queen and then King George VI refused to leave Buckingham Palace, which was also bombed. Nothing better advertised the fact then or today that everyone was in this thing together. There have been many Americans here this weekend. Many have participated in all the major celebrations. Some have taken time for private reflection in the American cemetery. Overall, there has been great nostalgia for the time when, as so many vets have put it, they were young and they were right.
But I know we'll meet again some sunny day.
That's the great Dame Vera Lynn, who was the voice for the British Army in World War II and who was singing here in Hyde Park the other night. And it's sort of a reminder here on Family Day as part of this three-day celebration. You've got three generations involved, grandparents and parents trying to explain to the young what it was all about, and many of the young absolutely fascinated. There have been as many young people here as there have been middle-aged people. Now, this has sort of moved on. There were these 50 leaders here from the various countries that fought in the Allied cause. Now they've gone on to France, where today in the Champs-Élysées they celebrated the end of the war. Paris, of course, had been liberated 9 months earlier. But for what went on today, in general, ABC's Jim Bitterman.
This morning, along Paris's broad Avenue des Champs-Élysées, exactly where the end of the war was celebrated a half-century ago, the anniversary was commemorated as it never has been in the past. 10,000 people were invited to watch the 20-minute military parade. And the ceremonies meant to honor the living and the dead from the war that liberated this country and the rest of Europe. But at least part of the reason for the lavishness of the commemoration today is that this anniversary also marks a new era for France. François Mitterrand, at the end of his presidential term, was accompanied this morning by Jacques Chirac, who only last night was elected his successor. The French president is the last leader who was directly involved in World War II. Many feel there's a new Europe now with the passing of Mitterrand and others of his generation.
In their roots, in their body, they feel the war, and they don't want to see that again. With Mr. Chirac, I don't think it's going to be the same.
50 years after the Allied victory, Europe's nations are now in the hands of new leaders who, for better or worse, have little recollection of how this continent once exploded in the world's worst war. Jim Bitterman, ABC News, Paris.
Charlie Gibson put his finger on it when he said commemoration as well as celebration, because there's a somber mood here as well, but not nearly as somber, of course, as it was in Washington 50 years ago when the war in the Pacific still loomed so large in American lives. We're going to go to Arlington National Cemetery now for the rest of the day's happenings. Here's Mort Dean. Mort?
Thank you, Peter. Good morning. President Clinton is marking VE Day today in ceremonies beginning with a wreath laying at the Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington National Cemetery. And later this morning, the president arrives here at Fort Myer, Virginia, the military facility just a short ride from the White House. The ceremony here will be attended by 5,000 veterans, diplomats, and survivors of the Holocaust. This afternoon, Mr. Clinton leaves for Russia to attend tomorrow's VE Day ceremonies in Moscow and to hold a brief summit meeting with Russian President Boris Yeltsin. 50 years ago, there was dancing in New York's Times Square as exhilarated Americans celebrated the Allied victory in Europe. For the surviving U.S. veterans of Europe's bloody battlefields, today is a day for solemn reflection and remembrance.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
We talked a lot about our feelings in my squad, and we were happy to have been able to participate in the end of the war. However, we thought about all of the people who made it possible for us to be there, all of the people that died.
We were very glad. Of course, there were mixed emotions because we expected that the fellows in Europe were going to have all the fun while we were here soldiering in the Pacific. And there was a bit of jealousy because we figured they'd get home before we would.
We didn't have a whole lot to be really jubilant about, except that one phase of the war was over and we could concentrate on on the second phase, or the last part of it, if you will. Hopefully get it done and go home and then celebrate.
I was proud that I was there. I wouldn't have missed it for the world.
We are among the most fortunate, but we are a dying breed, and as you well know, eventually the young generation will realize, and I'm sure they will, the sacrifices we have made for the freedom and the liberty of the world.
ABC News will provide special coverage of the commemoration of VE Day at Fort Myer and a wrap-up of VE anniversary events in Europe. On the eve of his departure from Moscow, President Clinton had a message for Russia. In a speech to a pro-Israeli gathering last night, Mr. Clinton warned that Russia would endanger its own national security by going ahead with plans to sell nuclear technology to Iran. But Mr. Clinton rejected Republican suggestions that aid to Russia should be cut if Moscow does not cancel the deal with Iran. A possible change of position in the battle over Surgeon General nominee Foster. The Senate Majority Leader Robert Dole had threatened to keep the nomination of Dr. Henry Foster from reaching the Senate floor, but he said yesterday that Foster did a pretty good job testifying before a Senate committee, and Dole said he wants to meet with Foster before making up his mind. A punishing storm system that's been plaguing the South for days is being blamed for at least 21 deaths. 3 people were killed when a swarm of tornadoes soared over Oklahoma yesterday. In Texas, 1 man died when a twister tossed him from his porch. Storms killed 18 people in Texas since Friday night. And that is ABC News on the Hour. I'm Morton Dean. Back to Charlie and Good Morning America in Europe. Charlie?
All right, thanks very much, Morton. Thanks, Peter. We're going to go right back to Rotterdam, where Spencer Christian is located this morning. He has the weather back in the States. Spencer?
Yes, Charlie, good morning again in Rotterdam, in the port district of Delfshaven, overlooking one of the city's many canals. We told you earlier that Rotterdam is the world's largest and busiest port. How busy is it? Well, each year, more than 300 million tons of goods are shipped in and out of this city. That's pretty busy. Things are not quite so busy on our weather map today as we take a look back home. It's going to be a nice calm day for much of the nation, although quite active weather in the nation's midsection with showers and thunder showers reaching from the western Gulf Coast up to the mid-Mississippi Valley, and from that point northward and then westward across the northern plains and into the northern Rockies. Look for a rainfall, which could be locally heavy at times. High temperatures today will be very much like they were last week. A little bit cooler in the northern tier of states than you would normally expect this time of the year, particularly the north central and northwestern states under cloud cover. And the southern states will be nice and warm with really toasty temperatures in southern Texas. That's a look at the national weather picture. Here's a look at what's happening where you are.
Germany's surrender in World War II is one of the pivotal events of the 20th century. Garrick Utley now looks back at the last days of the war and explains what happened during those 337 days after the Allies invaded occupied France.
It was the final turning point of the war. Since D-Day 1944, the Allies had been rolling across Europe. By December, the end of the war seemed near. Faced with defeat, Hitler launched a blistering and dangerously effective attack on American forces at the German-Belgian border.
We knew that the Germans were trying to make a last-ditch effort, and that if we were able to break that and drive them back, then we were on our way to the end of the war.
It was the Battle of the Bulge, one of the war's bloodiest.
It seemed that Hitler had pulled off one more miracle, and suddenly it appeared that they could win the war still. Well, the Allied armies held in the Bulge. Well, the American armies held in the Bulge. Only just, but they held.
By the end of January 1945, the German army was finished as a fighting machine on the Western Front, and just about everyone knew the war in Europe was over. Everyone but Hitler. The air war had intensified, battering German cities one by one into fiery rubble, and British and American forces fought their way across the Rhine.
Once the Americans and the British got over the Rhine and started the penetration into the heart of Germany, the resistance began to melt away.
On the Eastern Front, the Soviets rallied their best troops to fight the battle for Berlin. Still, Hitler would not surrender, telling his aides that without victory, the German people do not deserve to exist. In early April, the advancing American army began fighting its way into places that made even the battle-tempered veterans gag in horror. The Soviets had liberated Auschwitz in Poland earlier, but the horror of Nazi concentration camps like Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau was not widely known in the West. Until now. Ebe Melchior was a U.S. Army intelligence officer when he went into Dachau.
It is the sort of thing that no words can even begin to describe, and no pictures, because what sticks with you is the smell. It never gets out of your nose.
On the same day U.S. soldiers began liberating Buchenwald, Americans were stunned by the unexpected death of the man who had led the nation through the Depression and the war. President Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12th, just as victory in Europe was so near.
To us, we knew two names. One name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. And the second name was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Those two names we knew. Those are the two heroes that possibly going to help us to survive. And now one of them was dead.
And now there was a new name and president, Harry Truman, to see the nation through to the end of the war in Europe. The American army from the west and the Soviet army from the east fought their way to a rendezvous on the banks of the River Elbe. Germany was cut in two. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker. He ordered his body burned so that the advancing Red Army would find nothing but his ashes. May 7th, General Alfred Jodl surrendered the German armed forces unconditionally at American headquarters in Reims, France. On May 8th, the end of the Third Reich was officially announced.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
Coming up, a first-hand account of war and of liberation, as seen through the eyes of a young Dutch teenager, as Good Morning America's Passport to Europe continues from the Netherlands.
Back to Maastricht, and I am with a gentleman named John Grouse. He was 16 years old when this city was liberated 50 years and 9 months ago on this VE Day. Mr. Grouse, your thoughts?
Yes, I remember the day as it was yesterday. In that,
the Liberation Day here.
Liberation Day in Maastricht.
Yes.
So that by the Old Hickory Division. On Wednesday afternoon, we saw them coming in. We thought they were Tommies, as we called them. But afterwards we learned they were GIs for the Americans, and that's why we said the Amerikaners in there.
So many nations involved in the liberation of Holland, but it was Americans that came through here, and I gather you were out and saw the first tanks that came in, is that right?
Yes, from my parents' bedroom, I could see just across the road into the fields, and I saw them coming, and we heard the shooting, and it was a small group of about 6, 7, and the first one I met was a tall American second lieutenant, and he spoke German.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I gather you pointed out where some Germans were to them, still here in town.
Well, yes, it was something that happened in the Germans, when the Germans invaded, was some Dutch soldiers. The street where I live on, at the end, makes a Y crossing. So there are two dead corners. And I saw a German peeping around the one corner, and give a sign to his comrades. And they followed him up to the other road. And I went to the lieutenant and I said, there are Germans over there.
Back in Rotterdam at the historic port of Delfshaven, and I've been talking about the history of this district since we've been here today, but the history I'm talking about dates back much farther than just World War II. It goes actually back to the days of the Pilgrims who all American school children know, made their voyage from the Netherlands to the New World, and that voyage began right here at the historic port of Delfshaven. Joining us right now is Bertie Pallenstein, who is not one of the original pilgrims, but she does commemorate their life and times here in Holland before they departed for the New World. This is the 375th anniversary of their voyage, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And it's being commemorated all over Holland, I guess.
No, I think just here, the 25th and the 24th of June.
And you are dressed in period costume from the early 17th century. This is how a pilgrim woman would have been dressed in that time?
That's right, sir. Yeah, they did quite a lot of research, and they think women looked like that time.
Now, tell me about the various items you're wearing here. This is it looks like quite a heavy outfit.
Well, it is right. I am quite heavy here because I wear a bum roll.
Yes.
That was like fashion in that time. Queen Elizabeth from England, she brought it into fashion.
Right.
And the higher station you are, the more heavy a bum roll you have.
Of course, I see.
And then I wear a corset.
Right.
I'm quite flat here, as you can see.
I did not make that comment, you did.
And that's fashion in that time.
Yes, it was fashion.
And then I wear a koi.
Yes.
It was usually in that time that the women were not showing their hair.
We're not showing the hair,
No,
right.
It was not proper for
not proper.
A woman to do so.
Exactly. Now, on what occasions do you dress this way? Each year in June there's a festival, I understand?
Well, no, this is the first time we're going to have this festival here in Delfshaven.
Coming up in June of this year.
Yeah. But I usually give like some lectures about Plymouth Plantation, where I used to work as an interpreter for some women groups here in Holland.
We'll talk about that a little bit. You actually spent 12 years living in the U.S. and about 4 years working at Plymouth Plantation?
That's right, sir. That's right.
And then you moved back here to your homeland?
Yes. And I miss Plymouth Plantation so much, so I love to do this work now here in Holland.
Tell me about the items in your basket there. I presume these are things that would have been commonly found among the pilgrims during that time in the early 17th century?
This, for example, is a cup, a drinking cup. People were drinking a beer that time, and this is a drinking cup with two handles.
Two handles.
So it's for sharing, for easily sharing. So
how about that?
People were poor that time, so they didn't have that many cups in the house. So that way you could share.
If you had only a little bit of beer, there might be a struggle over who would get the last
No,
sip.
they were drinking quite a lot of beer, sir. They were not drinking They were not drinking water.
No. Okay.
Drinking beer.
And what else do you have in there?
Well, I have little children.
Yes.
When I act as a role player, I have little children. So then I usually bring this. It's a little puppet.
Ah, of course.
For my daughter, and she's dressed the same way as I am dressed. So children play with a puppet like that in the 17th century.
Yes.
And then here's another toy, a ball and a cup. Children used to play with that as well. It's to train their muscles.
Sure. And
See,
to train them.
You have to throw this ball like forwards like that, and I have to get the ball right in
and
here.
catch it in the cup.
Right.
It trains hand-eye coordination.
Right.
Which I obviously don't have this morning because the wind is blowing.
Children are very handy with that.
Yes, they are. Well,
Yes.
I have grown out of my childhood years, which is why I can't do that anymore. Bertie, thank you very much for joining us. This is quite interesting. I wish I could see one of your full performances. Maybe when the broadcast
you
is over.
should come back the 24th
come back in June.
and 25th of June.
We'll try to come back.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Charles Gibson. I speak to you this morning from Maastricht in the Netherlands, but what you are seeing there is the scene in Arlington National Cemetery, just outside Washington. In this half hour, President Clinton will be coming to the ceremony to lay a wreath in honor of Americans who died in World War II.
And I'm Joan London. Good morning, everybody. It is Monday. It is May 8th, and we begin week 2 of Good Morning America's Passport to Europe. And this morning we are in Maastricht in the Netherlands. This city was overrun by the Germans early on in 1940 and then liberated by American troops 4 years later. And coming up, we will have 2 American veterans who were in the infantry division that rescued this city.
I should also mention that with us through the morning will be our geography editor, Harm de Blay, who is also a native of the Netherlands. And 50 years ago today, so emaciated by the lack of food in the war, he couldn't walk, and he was propped next to a window in his home here in the Netherlands, waiting for word that the war was over. We'll be talking to Harm. But first this morning, we want to go to London. Peter Jennings is standing by there, and Peter has been covering the VE Day observances all throughout Europe. Peter?
Well, Charlie, it's been incredibly moving on these islands. You know, we've been a great big celebration here in Hyde Park, and this is Family Day. But if you take a quick look now at what's going on outside Buckingham Palace, you'll get some real sense of the enthusiasm there is here at the moment. That's Cliff Richard there at the moment, one of Britain's most popular folk singers. And inside the forecourt of Buckingham Palace at the moment and outside, there are thousands and thousands of people. This was very much the center place piece at the end of the war 50 years ago. And when the royal family came out then to the great beckoning of the crowd 50 years ago, everybody was absolutely convinced the war was over. And people have gathered there today because the royal family is going to come out again. There's going to be a flyover of some of the old vintage aircraft of World War II. I hope we'll have a chance to see that as well. But there was a real party atmosphere here, and all across this country. There are street parties all over the place. Every community, it seems to me, has celebrated in some way or other, whether it's in England or Scotland or Wales or in Northern Ireland. And they've all had this very profound, nostalgic cast to them. The young and the old, remembering both the celebration but also the hardships of 50 years ago. The war was over here, but for example, rationing in Britain didn't go out for another 5 years. So when it ended on this great high, there were still many hard days to come. Charlie?
All right, thank you very much, Peter. We showed you the picture from Arlington National Cemetery just a few moments ago where the president is coming. We're going to take a commercial break. When we come back, we will go to a U.S. military cemetery on this side of the Atlantic, here in the Netherlands, where our Steve Fox is standing by, and you will meet two of the U.S. servicemen who actually liberated this town of Maastricht from the Nazis. That one, Good Morning America's passport to Europe, continues. It is 35 minutes after the hour. World War II claimed 50 million lives, military and civilian. That is more than any other war in history. 73,000 plus of the Americans who died in the European theater of the war remain buried in Europe in a number of U.S. military cemeteries in places like Normandy and Luxembourg and Ardennes. One of the U.S. military cemeteries is right near here, our town of Maastricht. It is in the town of Margraten, and Steve Fox is there. The cemetery is a beautiful place, and Steve's going to show a little bit of it to you. Steve?
Good morning, Charlie. It is probably true that the American military cemetery in Normandy is the most famous in all of Europe, but Margraten is really only slightly smaller. Here, the graves of 8,302 soldiers are marked with either a simple marble cross or a Star of David. Here also is a memorial wall engraved with the names of 1,722 soldiers lost in the war whose remains were never found. This is the only permanent U.S. military cemetery in the Netherlands and one of the largest in Europe. So on a day like this, VE Day, it's a very special place for the American veterans who return here and for the local people who commemorate the event as well. Joining me now are two American veterans who helped liberate Maastricht in September of 1944, Frank Towers and Francis Curry. Thank you both for joining us this morning. Frank, let me start with you. What was the liberation of Maastricht like? Was there a lot of fighting?
There was not very much fighting in the town itself. As we crossed the river, the Germans were on the run coming out across on the other bridge.
What about civilian reaction in town?
There was a great amount of jubilation. They were happy to see us come. They were really in the way of fighting a war. It was unbelievable the way the people were reacting and coming out into the streets and rejoicing.
While the fighting was happening, they were partying.
While the fighting was going on. They could care less.
Francis Curry, I'm interested in your recollections of VE Day 50 years ago, when you were in the midst of the fighting.
Well, on VE Day 50 years ago, my company was dug in up along the Elbe River up at Magdeburg.
You were a 19-year-old rifleman.
I was a 19-year-old platoon leader at that time.
And what were your thoughts? The war is over, they tell you.
My thoughts were, the war is over, we did a good job.
All right. Frank Towers, your recollection of VE Day?
Well, I was in a similar situation at Magdeburg, and we were informed then that we were going to the Pacific to finish fighting that war down there, so we weren't too happy about it. But the fact that the war in Europe was over, we were happy for that.
Francis Curry, you won a congressional, actually you received a Congressional Medal of Honor for your action during the Battle of the Bulge. You were invited to the Arlington Cemetery celebration today. We're pleased that you came here with us instead. Should people think of this day as a celebration of peace, or is this a day of remembrance?
I prefer it as a day of remembrance.
A platoon sergeant you served under is buried here.
Well, it was served with, yes. Charles McCullough.
And what are your thoughts when you visit his grave?
Very emotional.
Yeah? Tell me if you can.
Well, Charlie and I went through the bulge together. We were both promoted. We were both platoon sergeants at the same time, and he was killed right below here in February as we crossed the Roy River.
Huh. Frank Towers, there is a tradition here, a very touching tradition. Local people have adopted each and every one of the graves here. Where did that tradition start?
That started right here with a man by the name of Joe Lars, who was a town clerk in Margrotten. He got a group of people together and formed the organization that has grown, and today each one of the graves in Margrotten is adopted by one or more families.
Now, what do you mean adopted? What do they do?
They consider this grave as their own son. They come here once or twice a year, sometimes more, and place flowers on their adoptee's grave.
50 years later, this continues?
50 years later, it happens all the time. There's never a time that I come out here, but there are flowers, there are people decorating the graves of their adopted son.
I can't help but wonder how that makes the two of you guys feel. I mean, you fought, you had friends who died in this conflict. Now to see that kind of appreciation from the people of the Netherlands, can you tell me how you react to that?
Well, we feel great to know that our efforts were not in vain, that these men have not been forgotten. Their parents, their next of kin may be all deceased, but these people remember them as their liberators, and they respect them.
Francis, your thoughts?
Well, I go along with Frank on that. It is very nice that the people do remember that. To our knowledge, this is the only national cemetery in Europe that this has occurred.
Sort of makes it seem all the more worthwhile, I guess.
It does.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this morning. Charlie, back to you.
As Peter Jennings was mentioning earlier, the British royal family has been very much at the center of the British remembrances of VE Day 50 years ago. Obviously, the young royal is very important, but it is the Queen Mum who was largely responsible for carrying the British through World War II. She has made an appearance just a few moments ago in London, and Peter Jennings is standing by. Peter?
Thanks, Charlie. Let's go very quickly to the balcony at Buckingham Palace right now. There's the Queen Mother in the center. And beside her, as you look at it, on the right is Princess Margaret. That's Dame Vera Lynn. Listen for just a second.
The dawn comes on. There'll be bluebirds over white cliffs of Dover.
The great romantic song of World War II.
Just you wait and see. There'll be love and laughter and peace.
Queen Elizabeth there on the left was a young girl during the war. Her mother, Queen Elizabeth and King George VI, never left Buckingham Palace even when it was bombed. And Princess Margaret on the right, perhaps the saddest member of the royal family, had a long love affair with a British Air Force group captain, but was never able to marry him.
The valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see.
50 years ago, it looked pretty much like that. In fact, the Queen Mother dressed roughly the same. The only thing missing is, of course, the great British wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill. This is part of the celebration here today of fly-past of World War II aircraft. One of each, there aren't many around, and
Today by Major Ian Cornwell, AFC. During the war, the aircraft saw service in every
the Spitfire, the great great backbone of the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force, which fought the Battle of Britain in these skies. Buckingham Palace, the Royal Standard flying as it always does when the royal family is in residence. They have been absolutely the centerpiece of this celebration here this week, as the British and of course everybody else on the continent remembers what it was they were fighting against for those long years of war which came to an end 50 years ago today. Now we go to Arlington National Cemetery in Mortine.
Peter, the solemn ceremony of remembrance has begun at Arlington National Cemetery. The President is there, and let's watch and listen for a moment. The President has just presented the wreath at the Tomb of the Unknowns. And there interred are unknown veterans, victims of various wars, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and of course World War I as well. The ceremony honoring the nation's dead at Arlington National Cemetery. The President in attendance, along with the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the various military staffs in the United States, and the Secretary for Veterans Affairs. The President now will be greeting about 50 veterans of World War II who are in attendance, and several of these veterans will fly with the President on Air Force One to Moscow later today for ceremonies in Moscow tomorrow and Mr. Clinton's brief summit meeting with Russian President Boris Yeltsin. It will be a busy day for the President. There is another ceremony here at Fort Myer, Virginia later this morning, and then the President begins his 8-hour and 55-minute flight to Moscow. We're going to go back to Europe now. Charlie?
All right, thanks very much, Mort. Events on both sides of the Atlantic, commemorations of this 50th anniversary of VE Day. Very poignant that the President shaking the hands of World War II veterans, because in so many of these observances, World War II veterans being honored, not only in the United States, but in all the nations of Europe. And so poignant to see the Queen Mother standing at the balcony of Buckingham Palace, because she was such a pillar of strength for the British throughout World War II, and the planes flying overhead. It is the older generations of the royal family so important. What you're looking at now, a laying of a wreath in Arlington earlier this morning. We will continue with our geography editor, Harm DeBlay, on the lasting impact of the war on Europe when Good Morning America continues.
The Netherlands remained neutral during the First World War, and that really saved them from the horrors and the ravages of that war. So in World War II, they expected to and really wanted to remain neutral. But on May 10th, 1940, they looked in the Dutch skies overhead and they saw those German warplanes that started bombing strategic targets, and the Netherlands was at war at that point. Our geography editor, Harm DeBlay, was a young boy at that time living here. And it's just amazing to think about it, because they did expect to remain neutral and wanted to, and yet I'm told they were very, very well prepared for that invasion.
They knew what was going to happen, I think. The evidence is that they were, because once the war started and the Germans attacked on this front in this direction, the Dutch forces stopped them, and for 4 days The Dutch small army managed to hold the Germans back, and
staved them off.
it was in a way a disastrous success. They did allow the royal family and members of the cabinet to go to England to set up a government in exile, but there was another consequence.
Yeah, now why was it a disastrous consequence?
Well, because when the Germans thought that they were going to take the Netherlands in one day, and when it took 4 days, they decided to bring capitulation about by destroying a major city. And one reason Maastricht looks as beautiful as it does and Rotterdam doesn't is because they burned and bombed the center of Rotterdam, destroyed it almost totally. None of the old 16th, 17th century buildings of central Rotterdam survived.
So they got their vengeance, their revenge on Rotterdam.
And that led to capitulation.
You know, talk about the numbers here, because I don't know if everybody realizes the numbers. 75%?
75% of the Jewish population of the Netherlands was killed. The total population of the Netherlands lost about 270 to 300,000 people.
Now wait a minute,
270,000 to 300,000.
If you compare that, to the population, what would it be like if we had that kind of a,
10 million, Joan.
It would be like losing 10 million Americans.
Imagine the magnitude of that shock in the population. Of course, this is only the numbers killed. There was enormous malnutrition and deprivation in the areas that were liberated late. It took, as you know, 11 months from Normandy to the north of Holland. And in those last months, the hunger winter of 1945, people died not because of German deprivation, they died of starvation. There was no food. There was no way to survive. And I remember seeing that in person.
Yeah, you remember that very well.
Right.
I also remember you were with me on D-Day in Normandy. Correct. And now when you think back to how long ago that was as we sat there and to today, that really brings home the fact of how long it took from the time that we came on those shores to get a
perspective of history, it's 11 months. But in the perspective of these people waiting, it was an eternity. And it was a disastrous event for the north of the Netherlands. Yes.
All right, Harm, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Good Morning America's Passport to Europe continues from the Netherlands after this.
Passport to Europe on RTL 5.
I just want to point out a strange little custom that we discovered here in Maastricht. If you can see over my shoulder, hanging from that building, is a dummy that they call Abraham. That's the biblical Abraham, who lived to be 175 years old. And when someone turns 50 in this country, actually a male, it's mostly a male-dominated custom, they hang a dummy of Abraham out his window. And if you want to know someone's age, if they're around 50, you say, has he seen Abraham? That means, is he around 50 or over 50?
And I don't know if anybody's asked you that question here in Maastricht, but apparently someone has, because it is true that you have seen Abraham, right?
Oh, I have seen Abraham,
Well, just come with me right over here, because some of your Maastricht friends have put together a little Abraham. Go ahead, sit down right next to a little Abraham there for Charlie Gibson.
Yeah, I'm the only one on this broadcast who's actually seen Abraham. I didn't know that you were going to have that. Thank you very much.
You didn't.
Isn't that sweet of you? Spencer Christian also is one of those who has not yet seen Abraham, darn it, and he is in Rotterdam. Spencer?
No, but I am a ham, though. I might add that, Charlie. But, of course, you knew that. Yes, I'm in Rotterdam, and I think it's worth mentioning again that Rotterdam is the world's largest and busiest port. The new port of Rotterdam, modeled after the historic old port of Delfshaven, which is where we are this morning. And I'd like to thank our hosts, Bart and Key Vermeer, who invited us aboard their historic cargo vessel, which is also their home. Let's take a look right now at our homeland's weather. See what's happening back in the States. It's going to be a rainy and wet day in the central part of the nation, from the western Gulf Coast up the Mississippi Valley, where thunderstorms will be numerous and possibly severe. Then from the mid-Mississippi Valley northward and westward across the northern plains, look for more rainfall, fewer thunderstorms, although there could be some locally potentially heavy thunderstorms. The rest of the nation will be mostly calm. High temperatures, warm in the southern part of the nation, still a little cool under all that cloud cover in the north central states, but down south, southern Texas, parts of the west coast of Florida, high temperatures will reach into the 90s today. That's a look at the national weather. Here's a look at what's happening where you are.
Maastricht, you can buy a cup of coffee with Dutch guilders or Belgian francs or German marks. You can take your choice, because cafes and stores, accept all three, even parking meters accept all three, which seems pretty convenient, but it's also pretty confusing. However, things could become much simpler if Europe adopts a single currency, and that is kind of a controversial issue over here. So here to try to explain it to us in plain English is Tyler Matheson, our money editor and also executive editor of Money Magazine. And it is, first of all, when we say Europe, which countries are planning to do this?
There are actually 15 countries that are members of the European Union. They span the whole map of Europe from south to north. 3 joined in the past year. They're actually, we'll go through a list of them: Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, Ireland, Great Britain, Denmark, the Benelux countries, Germany, and France. They were joined in the past year by Finland and Austria. 15 different currencies that presumably will disappear at some point down the road.
But just imagine if all of a sudden someone told you that you weren't going to use dollars anymore in the United States and you're going to use some brand new kind of money called ECU?
That's right. They're going to replace it with something called the ECU, or ECU, a European currency unit.
That seems like a hard thing to do, to make all these countries just stop using the money that they've used for hundreds of years.
It's an enormous and controversial undertaking, and there are a lot of people who don't believe that it will ever come true. In fact, Great Britain has kind of opted out of that European monetary union and said, we don't want to play ball. Other countries, like Belgium, may not meet the very stringent standards that have been set up for membership in this European monetary union, so they may not play.
Well, let's talk about why they would want to do it.
2 reasons, really. Simplicity, number one, and sort of the fluidity that having a single currency would mean. Let's take sort of trade and commerce, for example. Imagine if anytime you wanted to shop in Connecticut, you had to use Connecticut currency. You want to go to New York, you have to change the money.
Not to mention when you change money, they charge you a fee for changing money.
So that's a real drag. It's a hassle for the tourist and a real drag for businesses. Number 2 is monetary policy reasons. This treaty, the Maastricht Treaty, sets up a kind of European central bank like our Federal Reserve. Europe's never fought inflation very well, and the theory is that with one central bank fighting inflation for the whole continent, that inflation will be less a problem than it has been in the past, and maybe recessions will be
sort of evened out. But that means each country has to be willing to abide under these general rules in order to fight inflation. So they're going to be kind of dictated to by someone else.
And there's the rub, and that's why Great Britain, for example, which does not want to give up the Bank of England and the pound, has decided to opt out of the currency union. So there is sort of a give and take here, sort of a ceding of sovereignty in certain economic matters over to this European Central Bank.
We've been hearing about this for a while. I mean, how soon would this happen?
Not for quite a while, actually. Even the optimists say it couldn't begin to happen until 1997. The fair review is that it won't phase in until 1999, and really tourists probably won't start seeing this money, Americans, until well after the turn of the century, if it happens at all.
Yeah, all right, until then, what should Americans know about coming over here? First of all, should you change your money into European money, whichever country you're going to, back home or over here?
I think it's better to wait until you get here, because the competition here among the places that change money is much greater generally than it is back in the States. There are more options for changing money here, number one. So wait until you get here. Number 2 is to use credit cards on most of your transactions here. That's because, number 1, you get the float from not having to pay up immediately. Number 2, the big credit card companies get a better rate. They get the volume discounts, if you will, better than you can get right on the street at the little kiosk. Also, you may want to travel with traveler's checks, because while they may not get as good a rate as changing straight cash like we have here, there is the safety involved in carrying traveler's checks.
All right, Tyler, thank you very much, because it can get confusing trying to change money from country to country to country to country. When we come back, a first-hand account from Harm de Blay when he was a young boy here just outside Maastricht.
It is now 17 minutes after the hour. As we have mentioned through the morning, our geography editor, Harm de Blay, is himself a native of the Netherlands and rode out the war as a small boy in the small town of Soestdijk. And he had never returned to that hometown and his house since the war, but he did last week, and I gather it was a very emotional trip. Huh?
50 years ago, Charlie, I was there when the bombs dropped on Rotterdam, and my parents moved to a small village, and there was my home for 5 critical years of my life. I was able to visit it again. It was an emotional experience, and here's a small survey of it. I went back to my village, Soestdijk, where I attended the commemorations of the Second World War. I was here during the years 1940 to 1945, and I haven't been back in 50 years. This was my opportunity to relive those days. Here is where I live, and the present occupants of the home, Mr. and Mrs. Zwier Nederlof, were kind enough to invite me in to see what the house looks like now. from a child's point of view, the essentials are still there. My room upstairs, from which I could see the street in which so many momentous things happened during the Second World War.
Well, it's a lot smaller than I remember it.
One morning in the fall of 1944, I woke up, looked out the window, and there in that little park and in front of it was about a dozen Nazi soldiers with machine guns looking at the house. They were looking for my father. My mother hurried me down the stairs and out the house, the back, and to neighbors. And my dad managed to hide in a special place. He never was found. And this was my father's hiding place. There was a steel-plated fireplace here, and my dad hid behind it, and my father and mother pulled the plate against the opening so that he could not be found, and they did not find him. However, in other houses, the soldiers were smarter. They shot right through those fireplaces, and anyone sitting behind them was killed. Because of the location of our village between the advancing Allies and the retreating Germans, we had to spend 3 weeks in this 8x12 basement protecting ourselves against bombs from both sides. Here stood the Viersprong, a beautiful Alsatian-style villa that formed the centerpiece of my village. The Germans ordered it destroyed in 1944 after an attack on one of their facilities. They gave the occupants 15 minutes to get out with what belongings they could carry. The war deprived me and many other children of the joys of childhood. Survival became the essence of life, even for children my age.
The larder in that house, you saw it for just a moment, a lot of food there, but there was no food during the war.
There was no food then. The hunger winter had deprived the whole area of virtually all its sustenance. My mother took a long 100-mile walk to the north with her bicycle to bring back bags of potatoes. We had some fruit trees, and those were really the things that kept us alive.
And 50 years ago today, I gather you were fairly emaciated.
Yes, my dad and I were both down at the end of the war. My mother was the only one who was strong enough to survive and maintain the family. My dad was, I've seen him, he's 90, they're both living in Boca Grande, Florida now. I've rarely seen him in bed. He was in bed for many weeks. I was in bed for 7 weeks before being able to get back up again.
Just because of emaciation at
Absolutely.
the end of the war.
That's right.
Very emotional to go back there.
It was. My friends, the Nederlofs, who were kind enough to receive me, actually invited some of my old school friends who had also gone through the war with me, with whom I had the experiences that I described in the tape. And I had not expected that, and it was a terribly emotional event to suddenly see Hans Koch and Bernhard Battenberg, my old names I've remembered all my life and never thought I'd see again.
The kids you were playing hide and seek with when you were a child. Did you feel still a kinship with them, or do you feel that so many years and so many experiences have passed that you're no longer a part of that?
Well, our interaction was very interesting. I would say the answer is that we've drifted apart, both geographically and also in terms of what we do. Our lives have taken a different turn. The village is not the village we all remember. There was even a kind of a reticence to talk about those war years. It was very interesting. We were more interested in talking about family affairs since the war than to recount the unpleasant experiences we had.
The war is still that sensitive a subject.
Charlie, you know, all of us were very lucky. I mean, I talk about it deprived of my childhood having been ruined by the war. A lot of people had it far, far worse. So we all, I think, tacitly recognize that and try not to look back upon it too negatively.
Harm, you tell that story, which makes your heart grab even now, about your father hiding behind the fireplace. Why did they want him?
Well, my father was connected to the underground. He also had committed a public act of resistance. He was a musician, and he complained of not being well when he was forced to play the German national anthem at a critical moment on the radio.
And refused to play it? And they wanted him for that? Right. They were after him to do what?
Probably to be sent to a labor gang to work in Germany somewhere on a road or a dam or perhaps in those rocket factories.
How often in those 5 years did the Nazis come looking for him?
Well, I remember two principal events. My mother used to get a warning and send me away before it happened. He had someone who tipped him off, and that's how he survived.
Well, Harm de Blay, thank you for sharing what I know is an emotional and rather personal moment.
Welcome back. I'm Steve Fox. Good Morning America's Passport to Europe continues from here at the Margraten U.S. Military Cemetery outside of Maastricht. Joining me now are two of the guys who run this place, Frank Berloff, am I pronouncing it correctly?
That's correct.
Is a former U.S. Army major who has been the superintendent of this place for 14 years now. His assistant is Daniel Neese. You've been here for 4 years.
That's correct.
Frank, let me ask you, as I understand it, no one was buried at this cemetery for years after 1949 until recently. What happened?
On the 2nd of November 1993, a farmer about 50 miles north of here plowed a piece of field that had been used as a pasture land for 50 years, and he dug up some bones. First he thought it was an animal, and then he also found a boot, and so he stopped and called the police, and from there on it went through the whole system, and it was determined that there was Second Lieutenant Willis, a UTEC.
As I understand it, the remains were actually flown to Hawaii for identification?
They first went to Bussen, where the Dutch Grave Registration Commission is, then they went to Frankfurt. From Frankfurt they were flown to the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, and then when they were identified, someone from the, in fact it was Doug Howard from the Memorial Affairs Division up in Washington, went to visit the next of kin. And the brother, who was the one that had to make the determination, because he was the closest next of kin still alive, requested that if it was possible that he was buried up here at this cemetery.
Why? Why here?
Well, first of all, they both, he and his wife and his sister also are both in their 70s, and so there were no other relatives that could take care of the grave. Plus, they thought it would be nice because here he would be amongst his friends.
Huh. And where he died.
Where he died, that's right.
It is a little ironic that he goes from a few miles away from here, halfway around the world to Hawaii, only to end up back here.
That's right.
All right. And let me ask you about, there are 40 pairs of brothers buried here.
That's correct.
Now, why is that?
That was done at the request of the families. After, when the original cemetery was set up, they asked the families, and the families requested that the brothers be buried side by side.
Really? How about the women? There are a handful of women buried here as well.
4 women buried. 2 were active duty nurses. 1 was a warshipping civilian, and the other was a Red Cross worker.
At one point in time, this was a much larger cemetery. There was something like 20,000 bodies interred here.
Close to that, yes. There were 17,738 Americans and a little over 3,000 Germans.
Now there are 8,300 or so. What happened to the other bodies?
The other ones were returned to the States at the request of the next of kin.
And the Germans back to Germany?
And the Germans went to a large German cemetery in the northern part of Limburg.
Now I know that you were born here in Holland, and you lived as a young boy through the war.
That's right.
Can you help me understand this local tradition of adopting the graves? Local families adopt each one of these graves and commemorate?
They did that as a token of gratitude. It started a little different. It started by a relative of one of the soldiers that was buried up here asking Mr. Van Laar, who was very much involved at the cemetery at that time, if he could place some flowers on his brother's grave.
And now 50 years later it continues with local families coming out, even after 50 years.
In fact, it's even expanding again now because, you know, because of age, people have died off. But now the interest seems to bloom up again.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. Thank you both for talking to us. Good Morning America's Passport to Europe continues after this.
We're American family members stationed at NATO Air Base, Geilenkirchen, Germany. And today is Military Spouse Day. We would like to introduce the newest family members to their relatives in the United States. And we just wanted to say, Good morning, America!
I just want to say good morning, America, as well. We have another lovely setting today. I'm Charles Gibson.
And I'm Joan London. It is Monday, May 8th, and this is the second week of Good Morning America's Passport to Europe, and we are in Maastricht in the Netherlands.
I think most people know that the Netherlands literally means low country. And what was it you were saying earlier? 60% of this country
Is below sea level.
And so, as you might imagine, flooding has been an age-old problem for this country. It's actually becoming a rather modern problem as well. And so, in this half hour, our science editor, Michael Gillen, will be here to talk about how the Dutch deal with the flooding problem.
Yeah, a lot of people might remember, even seen in the news, I remember I saw just this last winter, they had catastrophic flooding. So we'll talk about how the Dutch are trying to contain rivers like the one just to the left of us. It's called the Maas, but it runs right through downtown Maastricht.
Maastricht is a walled city. You can see some of the old wall right behind us. It was walled in 1229, but the city's actually a lot older than that. It goes back to Roman times. This is actually a fascinating city tucked down in the southeast corner of the Netherlands. And this half hour also from our stage back in the center of town, you're going to hear the Johann Strauss Orchestra as they came in just a few moments ago to the stage. They got a round of applause.
These are the hottest acts in this country.
They have a CD that just in this area has sold 600,000 copies, hasn't been released totally through Europe yet, and it hasn't been released in the United States, so that's quite something. This morning for the news, we're going to be going in a few moments to Arlington National Cemetery where Morton Dean has the news, but Peter Jennings is standing by in London, and he has been covering the events of VE Day throughout Europe. Peter, it's interesting, in London, that was the centerpiece of VE Day observances yesterday. France and Berlin, Paris and Berlin will be the centerpiece today, Moscow tomorrow, and I gather you've been in Moscow the last few days getting ready for all the world leaders that are coming to that city, right?
Yes, in fact, Charlie, I've done it a bit the other way around, starting off with the preparations in Moscow, where the ceremonies have been taken very seriously for the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. Russians always on occasions like this demanding the rest of the world's attention to what a contribution they made to the defeat of Hitler. Here in Hyde Park today, it's begun to fill up again. This is a public holiday here in Britain, and there has been a tremendous outpouring of nostalgia about the end of the war. Also in Paris this morning, the leaders of the alliance moved on to Paris today, where they went to the Arc de Triomphe at the end of the Champs-Élysées, and to celebrate the 50th anniversary there. This was a tradition they thought they'd given up in France some time ago, but there was public pressure to come to the Arc de Triomphe again today and recognize collectively what had been accomplished in the long years of World War II. And there's been a change of government in France, or a change of leadership in France in the last little while, and a new prime minister there today, a new president coming up. Here in London, the Queen Mother there in the yellow, the Queen in red, and Princess Margaret, her sister, came out on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. And that has been very much the high point of the celebration here today, with thousands of people gathered below Buckingham Palace to sing all of the songs of World War II. It was a much more somber occasion in Germany, of course. This has been a very difficult time for the Germans. They've celebrated in the reconciliation process in various other capitals, but here this morning, these are Germans of an age who lived through World War II, laying flowers at the graves of Russian soldiers who captured Berlin 50 years ago. And that takes us back a little bit to Moscow, as I said, where they're preparing now. President Yeltsin went this morning to dedicate a statue to the great Russian general Georgy Zhukov, who one of the great generals of all time, who basically captured Berlin for the Russian forces, and a statue of him was dedicated there again this morning. So all across Europe, but I would say, Charlie, particularly here in Britain and certainly in Russia, these celebrations of what was accomplished in the long years of World War II, the good times and the bad times, of course, remembered very much. I talked to one vet here this morning, said, we set out in 1939 to do a job, we finished it finally in 1945. Back to you.
All right, thank you, Peter. The Russians make a good point. Western European nations, the United States, oftentimes forgetting just how important the Eastern Front was in the Second World War. And I gather, Peter, to some extent, the Russians don't even know fully how many people they lost in the war.
No, in fact, as historians take a closer look at it, the Russians particularly themselves taking it more seriously, but the figures just continue to go up. The conventional figure's always been 20 million people lost, but now the Russians themselves think it may be 40. The figure that President Clinton used the other day was 27 million. We were out in a small village outside Moscow the other day where they were burying bones of soldiers found only a week or so ago who were just left basically buried very hastily on the battlefield. So it's a very traumatic time for them.
All right, thank you very much. Peter Jennings reporting from London. As we mentioned, the centerpiece of VE Day observances 50 years later in London yesterday, today in Paris and Berlin, and tomorrow in Moscow. President Clinton, after he participates in a ceremony in Washington, will fly to Moscow. That ceremony is going to take place in Fort Myer, Virginia, that the president will attend in just a few hours, and Morton Dean is standing by there with the news of the morning. Mort?
Charlie, in a special place, there was a special ceremony this morning, Arlington National Cemetery, the Tomb of the Unknowns. President Clinton paying a silent and prayerful visit to that cherished place, bringing with him a colorful floral wreath and the grateful thanks of a nation.
Also this morning, another ceremony here in Virginia, here across the river from the nation's capital, here at Fort Myer. The President and Mrs. Clinton participate in a ceremony along with 5,000 veterans of World War II, diplomats, and survivors of the Holocaust. Then the President leaves for Russia. ABC News will cover events here at Fort Myer and other ceremonial events throughout the day. Congressional Republicans have a suggestion for President Clinton as he heads to the Moscow summit. Senate Majority Leader Robert Dole and House Speaker Newt Gingrich say the president should threaten to cut U.S. aid to Russia unless the Kremlin scraps its nuclear technology sale to Iran. In a speech last night, Mr. Clinton dismissed the Republican threat, but he said he'll tell Boris Yeltsin the nuclear deal would pose a threat to Russian security. What to do about Medicare is expected to be the thorniest issue when House and Senate budget committees meet this week. Both will consider Republican plans to balance the budget by the year 2002. House Republicans are expected to call for $280 billion in cuts in Medicare spending, but Senate Republicans are expected to call for smaller Medicare cuts. Many state workers in Oregon are off the job and on the picket lines this morning. About 18,000 workers began a three-day walkout over a pay and pension dispute. Talks between labor and management broke down last night. No new talks are scheduled. And that is ABC News on the half hour. We're going to go back to Europe now. Here's Spencer. Spence.
All right, Mort, I'm in Rotterdam, more specifically at the port of Delfshaven. A lot of history here. We told you Rotterdam is the world's biggest and busiest port. But let's talk a little bit about the history. This is the place from which the Pilgrims set sail when they began their voyage to the New World. And this church, the Pilgrims Church, in fact, was their church. It dates back to 1470. And we're going to learn more about the Pilgrims and their life here before they headed to the New World. But first, we're going to talk about today's weather. Let's take a look at the maps back home. It's going to be a calm day for much of the east and the southwest, but the nation's midsection will see lots of cloud cover and lots of precipitation. Thunderstorms from the mid-Mississippi Valley southward and showers northward and westward. Highs today will be generally in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, with some 90s to be found in parts of southern Texas and western Florida. That's a look at the national weather. Here's a look at the weather where you are. And coming up next, high waters in the lowlands when Good Morning America's passport to Europe continues.
It is now 19 minutes before the hour, and we are back in Maastricht in the Netherlands. And in this country, there is a situation where there is water everywhere, and in many instances you have to look up to see it. Because as we've mentioned, more than 60% of this country lies below sea level. So keeping land dry in this country is job number one for the Dutch scientists and engineers. And our science editor, Michael Gillen, this morning has a look at the way they do it.
The Dutch are winning the war. In the last century, they've seized more than 1 million acres of land from the surrounding rivers and sea, pumped it bone dry, first using old-fashioned windmills, and now using devices that boggle the engineering imagination. But the war continues along two fronts. The first along the coast, where gigantic dikes are struggling to hold back the North Sea. Back in 1953, the sea broke through here, and the Dutch suffered their worst defeat.
It was very bad. Almost 2,000 people are drowned there. And also the cattle and some people, you saw them into the water, dead. And it was a disaster. It was a big disaster, yeah.
The second battlefront is in the south, along the River Rhine and the River Maas. After a century of tranquility, these rivers have flooded twice in the last 2 years. Most recently in February, when 250,000 people were forced from their homes.
It was amazing, and you see the water is coming up, almost 5 to 10 centimeters an hour. And it's very high. It's frightening. It's very frightening.
The recent flooding is being blamed on record rainfall and on record snowmelt from the nearby Alps. Some say it's all because of global warming. Whatever the reason, the Dutch are worried, and they're turning to science for help.
At Delft Hydraulics, water engineers are working out a strategy for fighting the floods. Their conclusion? Defenses along the River Rhine need to be bolstered immediately.
The problem is that the dikes along the Rhine River date back to the 15th century. And there are plans available to heighten them and strengthen them. But there's a lot of debate in society about the question, how should they be strengthened?
Traditionally, strengthening the dikes has meant making them wider, but that robs the Dutch of some precious real estate.
There certainly are alternatives. One way to do that is to hammer steel sheets in the core of the dike. That comes as a price. It's much more expensive than the traditional method, but there's certainly a big advantage to it, namely that you do not have to destroy the existing housing and you can leave the natural and cultural values in place.
To prevent flooding along Holland's other southern river, the Maas, engineers are broadening it, removing 35 million tons of gravel from its banks. As the river spreads out, it'll create a natural wetland, a buffer zone, great for absorbing floodwaters and more, as environmentalist Don Shepard showed me.
Don, this is beautiful. Is this the way it's all going to look when it's done?
Yes, up along the river, wild horses, a whole lot of wildlife. That's what we think that's going to happen.
Widening the River Maas represents a rare surrender of land to the dreaded enemy, the water. But in 10 years, when these buffer zones become wide open spaces full of natural beauty, it'll also represent a rare triumph for a country 95% of which is covered by farms, concrete, and city centers.
All right, thank you, Michael. When we come back, that Dutch connection to the Pilgrims, as Good Morning America's passport to Europe continues from Maastricht and Rotterdam in the Netherlands.
Back in Rotterdam at the port of Delfshaven, the point from which the Pilgrims set sail for the New World 375 years ago. And joining me now to tell me more about the Pilgrims and what life was like for them here in the Netherlands is Marjolein Matheson, the director of the Pilgrim Fathers Foundation. I think most of us in the U.S. know that the Pilgrims came from England. What many people may not know is they spent 12 years here in Holland first. Is that correct?
No, that's correct. They started off in Amsterdam and then they moved to Leiden, where they went to live in Leiden for 12 years. And then they started off for Delfshaven.
What was life like for them here? They had their religious freedom here, did they not?
They had their religious freedom, and they lived in Leiden and they mingled with the Dutch. And they started off in the wool industry and in the press.
And this was their church, I gather?
And then they went to Delfshaven and they left from this church. That was the last church, and then they went off to England.
Now, where did the Mayflower come in? Because they did not originally leave here on the Mayflower.
No, they didn't. They left here from the Speedwell, and they bought here the Speedwell, and then they left for England to join the Mayflower, which was in Southampton. And then the two ships went off to the new land, but the Speedwell leaked, so they had to go back.
They had to go back.
And then they went all on the Mayflower, and they went to Cape Cod.
And so this year you're commemorating here their 375th anniversary of their departure.
That's right.
And is that being celebrated in the U.S. as well, I presume?
Yes, it is. In Plymouth, in Cape Cod, Provincetown, and in Plymouth Plantation.
Okay, Marjolein, thank you for joining us and sharing the history with us. Fascinating place. And Good Morning America will continue its passport to Europe in just a minute. Stay with us.
One of the hottest music acts in the Netherlands is André Rieu and the Johann Strauss Orchestra. Their CD, their even debut CD, has already sold more than 600,000 copies.
They are immensely popular. You're about to find out why. André Rieu and the Johann Strauss Orchestra with the Strauss Second Waltz. crowd that turned out to greet us in Maastricht. We have had a terrific time in what is a great city.
That's for sure, and Andre Rieu is still pleasing them. Tomorrow we're going to see you from Bruges, Belgium. Carly and Spencer and I are heading west to Belgium.
And they're going to play us off with the Stars and Stripes on this 50th observance of VE Day. Hope you have a great day. God bless. We'll see you tomorrow from Bruges, Belgium.
Europese bevrijding trekt de Amerikaanse ontbijtshow Good Morning America door Europa. Met ruim 150 medewerkers landde het Amerikaanse team in Maastricht voor een 2 uur durende live-uitzending. En Guus Marinissen was voor ons en die nam een kijkje achter de schermen.
Met schakelingen van Maastricht naar bevrijdingsactiviteiten in heel Europa zagen miljoenen Amerikanen gisterochtend natuurlijk beelden van tulpen en molens, maar ook de overstromingen van de Maas, het verdrag van Maastricht en een optreden van André Rieu.
Good morning, everyone. Good to have you with us. I'm Charles Gibson.
And I'm Joan London. It is Monday, May 8th.
Overigens 6 jaar geleden was het Good Morning America duo Gibson en London ook al in ons land.
We were in 1989. We were here, and we've had a marvelous time this time as well. This is a much quicker visit. Last time we did 4 shows in the northern region, if you will, and then 1 show down here in Maastricht, and we were based in Amsterdam the whole time last time. This time it's just in and out in 1 day, but we love the town of Maastricht. They have been so hospitable to us.
The cities that we have done have been incredibly diverse, and we are doing 5 countries in these 2 weeks, and so to us, this is like a real treat and a bonus. I've been on this program for 17 years in the same studio.
She was 50 at the time.
I know,
she started.
no.
She was 50. She's now 67. She doesn't look it, but she is that old.
We houden het op rond de 40. André Rieu is overigens niet nerveus voor zijn Amerikaanse tv-debuut.
Niet nerveus, maar het weer moet even meedoen nog.
We have good weather luck whenever we...
But we all did go into the church right there and light a candle this morning, just in case.
One of the hottest music acts in the Netherlands is Andre Rieu and the Johann Strauss Orchestra. Their even debut CD has already sold more than 600,000 copies.
They are immensely popular. You're about to find out why. Andre Rieu and the Johann Strauss Orchestra with the Strauss Second Waltz.
En zo wordt de Nederlandse koning van de wals in Amerika geïntroduceerd. Met een beetje geluk walst hij ze straks allemaal plat. En 8 minuten voor 9 Amerikaanse tijd gisterochtend keken ruim 8 miljoen Amerikanen naar onze André Rieu.
Natuurlijk, als je daar nu over nadenkt, dan denk je, oh ja, hebben we dat net gedaan? Maar nee, je staat gewoon op dit moment hier voor de mensen te spelen en probeert hier de sfeer te maken die we altijd maken. En het is weer gelukt. Hè.
Na Rieu, de Hollander Harm de Blij, die bij het ontbijtprogramma werkt en herinneringen ophaalt aan zijn oorlogstijd in de plaats Soestdijk.
He was here as a little boy. He remembers that day when the planes came overhead, and he and his family, suffered for those 4 years, and he was able to really give us his first-hand account in the piece where he walked in this morning to the home where. Had he been there? How many years?
Hadn't been back in 50 years.
In 50 years.
Since shortly after VE Day.
You don't really realize what it all means until you come here and you really talk with these people.
And they're going to play us off with the Stars and Stripes on this 50th observance of VE Day. Hope you have a great day. God bless. We'll see you tomorrow from Bruges, Belgium.
En als u het nog nooit gezien heeft, dan moet u zeker een keertje kijken. Een van de komende dagen tot en met 13 mei is Good Morning America te zien na koffietijd. Om 11 uur, maar dan wel op RTL 5.
Cadillac.
To say that this has been a wonderful, great 2-week trip through Europe is such an understatement. I hate to even say it that way, but to all the folks in all the cities that we have been to that have been so helpful and so hospitable, we say thank you. And to Mother Nature, who has threatened but never rained upon our heads, I say thank you.
I also want to thank all the people in all the countries we visited for being so patient and so tolerant as we butchered their languages, trying to pronounce their names, trying to order from the menus. They were so understanding.
Most of all, though, the guys who worked with the show. We mentioned the A team, the B team, the swing team that was with us each day. You camera guys, we thank you. Did you have a good time?
Did you have a good time? All right. And to our production staff who've worked for months.
Absolutely, that have been over here since time immemorial. I think they've taken out...
They're all coming home to see their families now.
They've taken out German, Austrian, Dutch, Belgian, and French citizenship.
Right.
We close these 2 weeks with a review of the sights and sounds that we have had here in Europe. We'll see you from New York on Monday.